All these are 16th and 17th century books from Florence. During the disastrous flood there in 1966, it was noticed that most of the medieval Limp Vellum bindings had protected their books better than any other type of binding, so that the study of Limp Vellum binding was undertaken again after lying dormant for 300 years. It is a tough and durable material that is flexible, as this dummy shows, and gives excellent protection to the book, since the structure allows the cover, sewing, and text block to move together in harmony. Using modern techniques and the right materials, there are no dangers of tannin or adhesive stains to ruin the inside of the book. This film concentrates on the techniques of rebinding, a suitable technique when the original cover is either missing or cannot be used. It shows the work of an expert whose deceptively easy skill is the result of many years' practice and experiment. The binding of each book is an individual affair, and the techniques shown here must be taken as guides, not final solutions. Mud stains from the River Arno and tannin stains from other books on the library shelves, as well as distortions caused by forced drying, led to a total rebinding of this book, though the original cover has been conserved. Here, a tannin thong has affected the vellum over the centuries, whereas tannin stains from other leather books have caused this damage during the flood. And here, sawdust has coagulated on the vellum. This is an example of an 18th century vellum of the degenerate grain split form, but not of the full thickness form of the medieval and contemporary skins, which make an excellent conservation material. It too has been weakened by light and attacked by the flood waters.
The limp vellum structure here discussed is not a case structure, but a bound one, with the spine-bound slips intertwining and locking the end papers, liner and cover all together. Over the centuries, lightweight, flexible and well-balanced structures and materials have often proved finer protectors against the rigours of time. The bindings belonging to the first decade of the 16th century still contain fundamentals of non-adhesive structures of the previous centuries and are well worth studying, but unfortunately, because of ignorance and insane rebinding policies, there appears to be now few left in existence. Limp vellum binding is essentially a non-adhesive structure relying upon sound sewing, folding, cutting and slotting techniques rather than the more modern form of binding, which relies a great deal upon adhesives. The range of tools shown indicate the subtleties necessary to deal with this form of structure and the differing characteristics of covering materials and text block. Tailor's pricking wheels for marking out the sewing along the joint of non-adhesive end papers. Sewing thread. The best kind is non-bleached Irish linen. Curved needles. A variety of folders, bone, ivory and stainless steel. I only use this on the flesh side of the skins. This ivory folder has a flat area which I can smooth the final fold with. Cutting instruments, shears and tailor's scissors, button-holing scissors, and a variety of pointed scissors. A range of knives made from high-speed steel hacksaw blades. I grind them to the shapes required. Surgeon's scalpels, very useful tool. You need a delicate but thick point to the knife. General trimming. Snips of varying shapes and sizes I use. You want a strong, precise tool. Pliers, long nose, flat nose pliers and tweezers. A range of sharp punches from 1/2 millimeter through to 5 millimeters. Chisels and gouges, I use a larger variety than here shown. Dividers for joint marking and yaps, band nippers in the foreground, banding sticks, rulers and straight edges, squares and micrometer. As we proceed through the film, I will concentrate mainly upon the new techniques and innovations I have developed, beginning with end paper structure. The most common end papers used in the medieval period were sheets simply hooked under the first and last sections and sewn in with a text block. But when the paste down is in place, there is often, upon opening the cover, a great deal of tension across the joint. The end paper shown here incorporates the hook under end sections, but adds an expanding fold along the joint on the paste down side. I refer to this concertina fold as a gusset. I make this in the following manner. Cut a sheet larger than the text folio. Fold in half, allowing on the forage the paste down side to protrude about twice the thickness of the zigzag gusset. I place a sheet of grey paper to show the overlap. To determine the width of the hook around the end section, you must consider the size and dimensions of the book, and also the thickness of the section. I tick off at head and tail, and with a fine ivory folder, score and fold right over. To avoid making a curved fold, I think the best technique is to set the hook and then turn it over and set it with the flat of a bone folder, making sure you do not bruise the paper. After the hook is set, replace the section tightly to the back of the hook, as the sewing will eventually pull it, and prepare the dividers for the width of the gusset. The gusset is mainly determined by the thickness of the sections, which of course vary. But as an example, on this quarto book, I wouldn't do a gusset wider than 4 millimeters. Set the mounting fold of the gusset and lay the paste down side right back and smooth flat. Reset the dividers about 1 millimeter narrower than the previous setting and tick head and tail. The outer fold of the gusset must be about 1 millimeter in front of the spine fold when the end section of the book is in place in the hook. The end paper folio is made slightly larger at head and tail, and after the end paper is folded, it is then trimmed. I insert a grey card here to show you how much forward the last fold of the zigzag gusset should be. The idea of a non-adhesive end paper is appealing, for in terms of conservation structure, it would allow the removal and replacement of a cover without the damage to the text block which would result from repulling. Shown here is one solution to the problem which has worked successfully in blank book tests. The end leaf is of parchment which lends rigidity to the cover, sewn to a whittled strip which allows for flexibility across the joint. This is a close-up of the make-up of that end paper. To produce the tawed goat joint, I cut a strip which is wedge-shaped in section. The full thickness of the skin is at the joint, and it tapers across the width, and so that the bulk is not in the cover. And then I scarf around it in this manner. This is the side which is going to be around the joint. And then I cut the ends so. The full thickness is needed around the joint for strength, but the tapered side is needed only in the cover. I have tipped a parchment fly to this side. It is difficult to see on the photograph, but the goat skin protrudes the thickness of the hook and joint and is tipped down with a little paste. I then prepare for sewing. I place the ruler along the edge of the parchment and with a marking wheel set out the sewing. This is just marking on the goat skin, and then I determine the width of the sewing and mark on the parchment. I begin the sewing from the reverse side of the end paper and start on the parchment, and then sew over into the tawed goat. In this manner, the edge of the parchment is smoothed down into the goat skin, and you have a smooth joint, and the end of the thread is hidden inside the covers. A parchment flyleaf is then prepared with a hook and laid down on the inside of the tawed goat joint. The hook, which is scarfed accurately and very straight, is then tipped down to the outside of this hook. It should look so. And then a Japanese tissue paper is taken and concertinaed around the hook. That is the hidden side of the end paper in the cover. Note the scarfing and the way the end of the thread has been trapped. This is the side of the end paper which will show in the inside of the cover. I then insert the first section into the first valley fold, the second into the second valley fold, and so on. And then place it on the book ready for sewing. I often take a concertina throughout the book. Spine sewing. The upper book is sewn on a traditional frame. The lower book was sewn on a frame adapted to sew in the round. Openability. Exactly same proportion dummies. Note how the books handle. First book, traditional frame, and note the curve down the spine and the way the pages lie. This second book is the one sewn in the round on an adapted frame. Neither book has been pasted. Note the shape down the spine and the way the pages lay. A little better, I think, than the first. Here is experiments in a technique where I've got a supported kettle and what I call a spine band, which rests on this supported kettle. Here is a single 3-thonged, rounded and pasted linen liner. The lower book is pack sewn on the frame while sewing, and the upper book rounded, lined and then packed sewn in the round. I consider the spine sewing to be of a vital factor or foundation to the success of a limp vellum structure, but there are so many considerations and variations within sewing that it constitutes a separate study. I'm only showing here one simple example. 3 double whittled thongs, single sewing to be packed or arched after rounding and lining of the spine. Note the curved needle. It has a blunted point. This is a traditional way. End bands are most important in limp vellum structures. They must be firmly attached to the ends of the spine. This exaggerated dummy shows you a modern trade headband, where the tie-downs are not in the centre of the section or underneath the kettle, and the liner is pasted down on top of the turn-ins. Here is a medieval primary sewing type. The tie-downs are in the centre of every section, underneath the kettle, and hold the core firmly to the top of the book. The liners in limp vellum bindings must be attached extremely firmly, particularly at either end of the spine. These 3 dummies show you the progression in making a medieval type crowned core headband. The primary sewing, the decoration, half finished, the silk does not tie down into the book, and the finished one. The crowning core is on top, and it works rather like a figure of 8. Modern end band, very unfirm, and the medieval type extremely firm. The modern one has a bead in front. My modern experiments in spine band sewings, and this is how I lace through the spine band, which is hidden inside the cover, and the primary sewing is on the other book. The built-up kettle makes a shelf so that the spine band is supported well. The spine band is the lower book here. The preparation of a book for end banding. Rona is placing flashes inside the centre of each section, although on a small book of these dimensions it is not necessary to sew down in the centre of every section. The preparation of the end band core, I cut diagonal tapered from the flesh side to the grain side. From a prime piece of whittawed goat, not from the flanks or offcuts. And because I'm so uncertain and unhappy about modern leathers, I always use Irish linen braid inside the thong. This will not show on the finished binding, but it gives me a little more confidence that the strength is there at the joint, and especially in these end bands at the head and tail of the spine. I form the core into a U and curve it into the shape of the spine. The end of the thread is a simple hitch. If it's correctly twisted, then the end of the thread should lay in the direction of the sewing at the back of the core. Rona now places the needle in the center of the end paper and makes sure that it goes underneath the kettle. She's having a little difficulty here. A blunt needle is best for this. It finds the kettle hole quicker. This will give her a very firm start. That is how you make your loop. Make sure the end of the thread is tucked in also. She will tie down in the first 3 or 4 sections, and then on this book she is doing every other section. You can see the space in the tie downs at the moment. And now she will carry across the book in a similar manner until she comes to the other end, and then tie down in several places, centers of the sections, and she finishes by hitching several tie downs and then finishing with a knot which is well away from the joint of the book. One can see how this type of end-band tie-down traps the linen liner to each end of the spine. One can also see the pack sewing of the thong. She now fans out the end of the thread and pastes it down to the liner. This is just to keep it out of the way while one is covering the book. The medieval binders used paste on the spines of their text blocks. This has proved over the years to be less damaging than the hide glues first appearing in this capacity in the 16th century. To prepare a book for covering, this one is 3 double thongs. First extend the center cut and finish with strong points on each thong. The U-type of end-band core I usually reduce in width. It's according to the dimensions of the book, but this small book I reduce the core in width in this manner. Now the Irish braid, which I've stuck onto the other side of the core, is placed at the back of the core so that I avoid cutting it. And the snips, being so accurate, are very useful at this point. After cutting the thongs on both sides, I then place boards for protection either side of the book and place the book in the finishing press. This book is going to have what I call a slotted spine technique, where tawed goat patches are used across each of the thongs on the spine for protecting the spine. This kind of binding allows you to get the vellum cover closer. The patches are scarfed in this manner. Of course, I do 3 patches together, but here I just show one for quickness. I take a piece of paper and measure the width across the spine and transfer this with a pencil to the flesh side of the tawed patch. I then select a punch, which can be punch a hole considerably smaller than the thongs, as the tawed material stretches considerably. I lace through one side make sure it's snug, and then accurately measure across. And mark with a pencil, and then punch the other 2 holes. I punch all 3 patches, and then with the dividers mark the width across the thong. The spine is vulnerable to physical damage, and so I wish to protect the sewing thread very well, and I am going to use a double thickness of tawed material. So what I do in this case is I transfer my measurement onto the flesh side and cut a strip. This is the width of the double thong. Scarf the end, measure between the 2 holes, double holes, and scarf the other end. This is then pasted flesh side to flesh side. No paste must get onto the inside, or the grain side of course, of the patch. It is not in any way attached by paste to the book spine. It should fit without showing through the holes, and I damp the leather. Well, it isn't leather really, it's tawed skin, so. And lace through onto the book. One has to wait at several stages during the binding of limp vellum, so I will work on about 6 books together. After this stage I have to wait and let all 3 patches dry in position. But they must not be stuck to the spine, but must, when the book is opened, they must move freely with the cover. Now, I have previously cut a template out of vellum to the correct size and length. The length of the slot is the exact width of the spine, and this will be left on the book until the patch is thoroughly dry. If your cutting is accurate, it should not wrinkle. I use then nickel-plated band nippers, which will not darken the alum salts in the skin to make firm. I often use a palette or tie the book up at this stage so that I get a string mark dividing the double thongs. Of course, this vellum template will be removed. Vellum and parchment skins readily respond to environmental changes. Limp vellum bindings, if correctly made, can retain their shape in various atmospheres and conditions, unlike stiff board vellum bindings, which will distort and strain their structures. But even so, I would always wish to have similar atmospheric conditions to storage of skins, binding, and final housing. Ideal conditions would be as cool as possible, with good moisture content and flow of air. But as people have to live and work with the skins, I usually suggest a temperature not above 68 Fahrenheit and with 60 relative humidity, and for the final storage, 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 60 relative humidity. Try to get manufacturers to pack skins flat, flesh side to flesh side, with soft, acid-free paper between each, and store them in this way also. Always handle skins with 2 hands, carrying around the workshop flat on a board, or if this is not possible, pick up a skin by the neck and tail and carry it so that the spine area supports the whole. Let skin float down and outwards onto the work area. It is easy to kink or otherwise mar a skin. Never handle even a small cover with 1 hand. It must be understood that the qualities inherent in the individual skins will, with understanding, become an essential part of the character of the volume's handling and movement, as well as the colour and texture. One must not forget that the medieval period came at the end of good quality vellum manufacturing. In comparison, modern vellums appear less stable, supple and strong. A vellum for covering purposes should be of natural fall thickness, though this in itself is a misleading statement, as vellums, unlike leathers, can vary enormously, has little to do with age, size of animal, but with processing of manufacture. The ability of a skin to fold on itself without splitting on the grain side, the surface to be resistant to abrasion with a minimal loss of natural oils during processing, not oils added by the manufacturer, note. Although the process of vellum manufacture is simple, one can obtain a variety of qualities of flexibility in a skin. Controlled folding techniques reactivate the fibril bundles of the corium layer. Here, the hair of the animal has not been completely removed. Here, warble fly have attacked the animal. On the flesh side, bad flaying marks. Warble fly or other damage have pierced right through the skin. This is just mottled hair, which I would consider natural, but add slaughtering techniques and the blood in the skin, I feel, is quite unnatural and poor craftsmanship. It would look quite wrong on library shelves. I have turned the skin over to the flesh side to mark it out and leave a generous margin. I never trim out with my precision knives, as this would only blunt them, general trimming. So a robust trimming knife is essential. Don't use your paring knives. The medieval craftsmen used the natural finishes and grains of the skin, and therefore for a forage flap he often used the neck of the animal, and he would use the gelatinous edge of the skin to support his tail of his book, and such kinds as this. I've arranged it so the spine of the animal comes down the center of the upper cover. This book is about 1600. And is rather narrow and rather square. Some of the books, of course, are quite irregular, and one must consider the individual problems of a book which is out of square. The generous turn-in sizes is because I've decided to make this book with non-adhesive ends. I use a sanding block instead of a paired edge. I find that it softens the edge and curls it towards me, that is, towards the flesh side, which when the turn-ins are in place in the upper cover or lower cover, they will set and curl towards the cover. I measure off the head and tail turn-ins. And make sure that they're parallel. With the cut straight edges of this 20th century technique, I feel that the scholar will not mistake my binding for a medieval one. I use a metal folder against the flesh and then the ivory folder against the grain. Set the fold carefully, turn it over and use the flat of the ivory folder to set the fold. No bruising of the grain side should appear. I have done the head turn-in first, and now I mark accurately as possible across the end bands the height, and now mark and make sure I'm making an absolutely parallel fold for the tail turn-in. The tail turn-in I have made slightly wider than the head turn-in. The same reason that you would move a picture up in a frame to make it look central. You have the bottom margin slightly wider than the top. You can see the curl that the sanding has given to the edge. I will set the tail in the same manner. Place it, the whole skin between pressing boards. Put a light weight on it and leave it to relax for 2 or 3 hours while I carry on with another skin. I check that it's parallel in this manner. Make sure you don't kink the skin as you do that. And I have to work over the animal's spine because it's a little thick. Notice I'm pressing harder from the inside and not from the outside. Note the curve. And now she'll rest with a light weight on the top for a few hours. The vellum is now relaxed in its new position, and I mark off the width of the spine. First, the lower cover spine score. Make sure it's exactly square with the head and tail. On this 17th century book, I'm using a sharp fold for the spine score, but on one of about 1500 to 1550, I do not like the sharpness over the spine. Tuck the book back against this fold and mark off the upper cover spine fold and set the dividers. You must be extremely careful at this stage to get a tight joint, and I check against the spine of the book and then compromise to my mark on the vellum When I feel I've got the correct width, I mark. Always start the bone folder from one side and then the other, or you'll spread the grain as the folder jumps off of the tail fold. Tuck the book well in and note the shape that it makes across the spine. Mark out the center of where you wish the holes to be punched in the cover and the head and tail of the book. In this close-up, note the Irish braid headband core. I take a template of vellum and I punch 2 holes and lace through the double thongs and judge what space I want, and then I mark out on the cover the placing of those holes. The headband core holes. The choice of punch has been chosen by the template which I cut previously, and then the double holes. The placing of them against the fold of the spine can only be judged through much experience. I then join the holes up with a small gouge. Make sure that the cuts do not go beyond the holes, otherwise you might form a running tear. At the head and tail of the spine, as this is a non-adhesive end, and I must get the head and tail turn-ins over the top of the end papers, I have to cut, and I have designed this method. This is a scarfing cut at the joint. The other cut is vertical. The curve needs to be a generous one to allow the cover to roll nicely as the book is opened down the joint, for this curve rolls across the joint. Note, I carefully insert the knife into the hole and then scarf off. Now, the vertical cuts and the scarf cuts are quite clear in this photograph. I then scarf from the flesh side, the turn-ins, and this matches up with the sanded edge. You can see quite clearly the sanded edge and then the scarfing with the knife. This will lay nicely against the parchment end. In fact, this book has paper ends and quarto, and I have not shown you how to make the ends. The joint here is marked out with an ivory folder of slightly wider than the metal one, and the spine, the thongs laced through. Waste sheet of card is placed under the first fly. These quarto ends, I use the first 2 flies of the quarto end inside the cover. Punch the hole through. Now this hole is going through the outer cover, through the 2 linen liners, and through the first fly of the end. Trim off at an angle the 2 liners. One liner comes from the end paper and the other from over the spine of the book. They're unbleached Irish linen. Now this first fly is laced through the cover and through into that fly. use the pointed tweezers to direct the thong, and then the fingers take over. The fingers are far more sensitive than any tool. So always finally pull the thongs with your fingers. Then a waste sheet is placed under the fly and linen liners, and other holes are drilled through at an angle. The angle continues the similar angle on each thong. The angle of the thongs over the joint may help the book to open easier, as the angle allows for a roll on the thong. And the first liner is tucked inside the turn-ins, and then the second. This is a design I did on some of the vellum books for Florence. And then the headband core are laced through the complete cover and the head and tail turn-ins. The thong is directed through here. It will hold down the end of the turn-in, and also, of course, make an extremely tight join for the book to the cover, making this limp vellum binding quite different from a cased limp cover. The thongs go through the cover and back through the linings and the end paper, making them into a bound book, not a cased book. This is tricky. I've placed the cutting card inside the cover, and I'm now drilling a hole back through the turn-in, the flies and the two linen liners, and inserting the thong. I then am experimenting in trying to improve this technique, but it is tricky, and I take pliers and pull through the thong so that it lays and traps the liner firmly to the fly leaves, or to at least the fly leaves which are inside the cover. With the book firmly inside the cover, I then mark off the yaps. With a book which is out of square, of course one never trims the edges of these books, I have great difficulty in determining my forage yap dimensions, and often it is a compromise. But here the book is reasonably square, but I always double check, butting the ruler against the spine, inside of the spine fold. And ticking off at the yap fold. The square at the forage, that is how far the yap protrudes from the forage, is somewhat less than the head and tail square. I then use an ivory folder to make the inside score for the yap. Note the two ways in using the folder to stop any chance of spreading the grain. The width of the yap on this particular book must be rather narrow. With the closed book, the yaps should never clash together. And so the width of the yap is really determined by the thickness of the book and the natural proportions of the book. I'm now scoring the forage, and the book is now ready to cut corners for. I have 3 or 4 different corners. This one here I've called a tab yap corner. They are all non-adhesive corners. This one I call a mitered yap corner. I first drill a hole. This is with a punch, 1/2 to 1 millimeter. This is approximately 45 degrees at an angle from the forage corner. And I cut down inside the forage fold and miter off to the corner. I insert the knife carefully into the hole so that I do not make a cut beyond the hole, otherwise I may get a running tear. So we do it again. A hole. It's not quite through. That's better. Insert the knife point into the hole and cut away. This cut inside the forage fold, and this cut is mitered out towards the forage corner. A diagram will have to be seen before this corner is fully understood, as with the other types of corners designed. I cut off the waste inside the head and tail turning fold. And now a curved cut is required right on the tip of the corner. And the same the other end. These limp vellums must be able to breathe and expand and contract so that they do not distort and buckle themselves. Also, as a conservation binding, one really wants to be able to take the cover off and rebind it without resewing the book, which does the most damage to the book. Therefore, a non-adhesive structure for a conservation binding would be most useful. Note, if you choose the correct width of bone folder, the vellum will fold itself. Note that this turn-in is slightly shorter than the head and tail folds. This allows for expansion and contraction. Note the little tabs on the very corner there, which will be tucked in. I mark out from the hole and at the head and tail turn-ins where I'm going to miter to. I've got a waste sheet of card on the tabletop and I punch the holes together. The position of these can only be placed after much experimenting. They must mate together so that they cannot be seen on the final binding. I cut off at an angle with a vertical cut. This runs from the hole to my pencil mark that I made previously. Insert the knife in the hole and cut. Insert the knife in the hole and cut off. To make the tabs easier to poke in, I just cut the tips off. They will then slip into the slots quite easily. You'll see that in a moment. Now I scarf the inside of that mitered edge. Make sure you don't go farther than the hole that you had punched, and trim off. This softens the edge nicely. Always work away from the hole if you can, but I'm extremely right-handed and cannot use my left hand for the tail end. Moisten the very tip of the corner and leave it a moment, and the vellum will get a little cheesy and you'll be able to mould it. The first one's in that state now. I use pointed tweezers and pull that little tab that I carefully cut inside, giving me a slightly rounded tip to the corner. As you can see on this close-up, note also the shape of the tab. Here is the finished corner. The holes will disappear as the forage turn-in pulls after tackets and forage ties. The binding has now relaxed nicely around the book and is ready for forage ties. I have chosen the peg variety. I have made the pegs from ivory, and the tensions are chosen not only from aesthetic points of view, but exactly where the pressure is required, and this varies with the size of the binding and the nature of the skin used for the binding. Mark around the peg with a pencil. Place a cutting card underneath the cover, close to the yap fold, and take a small punch. This one is about 1 millimeter. Punch 2 holes inside the pencil mark, and the width is determined to the Allen Todd strap you have previously cut. You will see one in a moment being cut. Second holes are punched beyond the peg, the cutting card having been placed underneath the cover between the turn-in and the cover. The Todd strap is laced through. Note the anchor hole in the end of the strap, and this is laced through between the forage turn-in. Open up that 2 holes with a cut in just by the yap fold. Place the cutting card underneath the whole cover and drill a hole right through. You have pushed the end of the strap forward so that it did not get pierced, and now one must lace the Todd strap through the turn-in and through the hole in the end of the strap, so making a non-adhesive anchorage. It must be very tight, and notice how I use my hands at this point and not pliers. Fit the peg back in the frog. It should be tight. It will slacken with use. And then set by rolling the strap really firm. The tension of the cover I make by rolling around a core. There is a thin card protecting the book at this stage. The staggered hole made is my tacket hole and is considerably smaller than the strap, so that the strap fills the two holes together and holds the cover under tension. Remember, I have not got a pasted end paper to hold the cover under tension and have to do it in this physical way. This is still rather at the experimental stage, but the cover can always be removed from the book and recovered without damage to the book. And in fact, this whole frog and strap could be replaced quite easily if it ever broke. So I have a forage tie plus a tacket stitch, which holds the whole cover firmly together under tension. I snip off the waist. One could pair the end of the strap at that stage and paste it, or just damp it so that it will set in a fan shape and not pull back through the hole. But I think this is so tight it will not pull back in any case. Now to fit the strap to the peg. I have a strap, whit-awed goat, tapered sides. I put the peg into place and position the strap across the spine, making sure that it's horizontal. I mark on the lower cover at the yap fold. And now this is a little tricky. I take a cutting card and place a corner between the two pencil marks in the forage fold and punch on the exterior of the forage fold, but not so that it goes and cuts the forage turn-in on the lower cover. Now I must prepare the end of the strap for the anchorage point. A hole is drilled through the full thickness of the strap. Do not start to thin the strap at this point. Strength is needed. The strength of these straps you could easily test. If you cut 2mm strip, it should not break in your hands when you pull. If it does, don't use that skin. Gently pull the strap, very gently, so that the hole coincides approximately with where you want to make the anchorage point. Lace on the peg. At this point, don't worry too much about the tension. Put a waist card underneath the lower cover turn-in, push the anchorage of the strap forward so that it is not pierced, and make your anchorage hole. This time it only goes through the outer cover and not the lower cover turn-in, or forage turn-in also. I make 2 holes the width of the strap and then join them with the gouge. I lace through, and now to find the hole in the anchorage point. Lace through and pull through. And then I shape the cover around a card tube again and make my tack hitting hole through the cover and the turn-in. I then lace the tacketing hole. At this stage I have also placed the peg back in the frog and judged the length on the strap required to hold the book closed under tension. And I finish in a similar way as with the frog on the upper cover. One may damp the end of the strap at this stage and then it will set into the hole, but I don't think it's really necessary if you have been accurately choosing your punches. One can always make short templates of off-cut vellum just to test whether you're punching the correct size hole, but mainly it is experience. I have doubts about the use of peg and frog forage fastenings, stemming from the fact that though a large variety of fastenings were used in medieval Europe, as far as is known this type was not used. It certainly has strong connotations with the Oriental book. However, it has certain advantages which I have not been able to achieve in other, more historically acceptable methods. The binding is now complete. The unique situation presented by the Florence flood of 1966, where covers were completely lost, stimulated the desire to commence this study. Of course, I will never condone the destruction of original binding structures or coverings, however badly damaged they may be, for I am convinced that the benefit to the future scholarship of such original Limp Vellum bindings is intrinsically within the whole historical object itself. This film was not visualized as a training film, but rather as a documentary of my ideas and techniques up to 1970. In order to appreciate the various tactile, visual and structural qualities Limp Vellums can display, one will certainly require a long study, firmly based upon historical sympathy and a sound working knowledge of tools and materials. Unlike paintings and prints, books are fully three-dimensional mobile objects, and a term such as book conservation, to me, does not simply imply the repair of text block and rebinding for normal use in the 20th century library, but also the restoration of qualities of movement, such as ease of opening, spine flexibility, and leaf flow. More often than not, the desire to restore a book to its original function has resulted in destroying it, the resultant object changing into a useless hybrid within the unreal fantasy world of conservation. What needs most to be preserved in a historical object is the spontaneous and unconscious qualities inherent in a particular age, but by their very nature, these are the most difficult qualities to retain in any conservation procedures, and almost completely impossible in a volume if one is forced to rebind it.